Today on the Roundhouse, we're going to be learning about the California State Railroad Museum. All aboard!
In days past, the roundhouse was where the railroad worker united with the steam locomotive, each to prepare for the journey ahead. Today, it's where we examine the history, the industry, the machines, the hobby, and the passion behind railroading. News, interviews, stories, and more. So climb aboard. This is The Roundhouse.
Welcome to the Roundhouse. I'm your host, Nick Gozarak, and this is episode number 125 of our Trains and Railroading podcast, where we're talking about everything in the industry and the hobby. You name it, and we discuss it. Today, we're continuing our crossover with the California State Railroad Museum. They interviewed me for one of their episodes of their official podcast, which I've linked in the show notes for this episode. And now I will be interviewing Kim Whitfield, who is one of the curators of the collection, and talking about what they have in their collection, some of the prized possessions that they have. They've got quite an assortment of equipment and documents and displays. So we're going to be exploring that, as well as their approach to sharing all of this history with the public. Before we get to that, though, another thank you to my patrons over at patreon.com/theroundhouse. Thank you for supporting the podcast and other creative endeavors that we're doing as part of Streamliner Media. I really appreciate the support. And if you like what you hear today, then go over to patreon.com/theroundhouse. For as little as $1 a month, you're going a long way to supporting the show, and I really appreciate it. Our guest today is a coordinator of exhibits and interpretive programs at the California State Railroad Museum. Please welcome to the Roundhouse, Ms. Kim Whitfield.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you on the show, Kim, from one Roundhouse podcast to another Roundhouse Crosstalk podcast. There's so much to cover with what you have going on, so perhaps you could just provide us an overview of the California State Railroad Museum.
Yeah, so the California State Railroad Museum is a state park, part of the state park system. And here at the Railroad Museum, we say that our lives are made of railroad stories, and that we tell the stories of the railroad through the stories of people. So when you come to the California State Railroad Museum, that's what you're going to see. You're going to see all things great and small, from large locomotives to small ephemera and objects and things collected by railroad workers and people who are associated with the railroad over time, both past and present. And you're going to hear about their personal stories. We also like to say that, we are a museum without walls. A museum is community and a laboratory of learning. And we really use those three pillars to express the work that we do here.
What does being a state museum mean exactly?
So the California State Railroad Museum is a part of the larger park system with Department of Parks and Recreation. There's 279 state parks, and those state parks include natural resources, areas that have been protected, historic sites like Sutter's Fort, and visitor centers. We're the only park in the state park system that's a purpose-built museum. So the Pacific Coast chapter of RNLHS, which is the Railroad and Locomotive Historical Society, started in the 30s. And they got together and said, the history of the railroading is going by the wayside, and someone needs to preserve this history. So that was their mission, to gather and collect locomotives and research materials and records and archives to preserve the history of the railroad. And they actually restored several locomotives. And so they had this collection. some time goes by and they're collecting and restoring. And they say, it would be great if the state's park system had a museum that we could put this collection into and share this history, because our lives really are made of railroad stories. Our culture is impacted by the railroad. Even if you don't think your life is made of railroad stories, it's embedded in everything from our language to our music to our movies, to even our city layouts. So if you try to drive across Sacramento in the middle of the day or on your way home and you're stopped at a railroad crossing and you say, oh, who put this railroad here? Well, actually, the city was built up around the railroad. And music is a great example. How many railroad songs can you name? Maybe 2 or 3, but if you Google it, there's like over 3,000 songs about railroads. Down to our language. I'm on time, I'm on track, we're getting off track. All different kinds of terms in our language that actually come from the railroad because we're railroad people. So their team got together, and one of our founders, Denny Ansbach, actually met with Reagan in the Gold Coast car. And they had a dinner and they talked him through the value of the museum and say, we ought to have a railroad museum in the state park system. And he agreed, and here we are. So they built the space because we're not a historic building. This is a brand new built space in the 70s. And we opened 1981 in May.
The impact of the railroad on culture is so broad in general, and it often does go overlooked. So it's good that you can draw attention to that. Part of drawing attention to that is having this really impressive collection. What are some of the highlights that you have?
I had a really hard time with this question because everything is a highlight. We have an incredible collection. And by collection, I mean all things great and small, and that is the cab forward is a great example. It's a huge locomotive. And the one that we have in our collection is the last of its kind, built to solve a specific problem of getting over the Sierras and going through tunnels and taking large loads across, through the mountains to get to the other side to continue forwarding the economy. Down to small things in our collection, like the Sefton collection, which is the toy train collection. And Sefton had a huge collection over time, and we only show maybe 1% of that collection in the museum on the 3rd floor. So all of the things, it's really hard to highlight just one thing, because we have so many really awesome stuff. So in addition to, the cab forward and the Sefton collection and all of the great things, big and small, that we also do have 2 items on loan to us right now from the Nevada State Railroad Museum. So that is the Dayton, which is a beautifully restored locomotive. And actually the coolest thing is that it has one of the original CP, a cast of the original CP builder's plate, and it's just really beautiful. And it's one of the last AJ Stevens built locomotives. And it was built right here in Sacramento at the shops, which is super cool. And then we're also this week going to be getting the commissioner's car, which is the last remaining car from the consist that was actually at Promontory, Utah in 1869 for the joining of the rails, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. And the commissioner's car has had a very long history. And the most interesting thing about it is that it is not restored. So you can see all of the different layers of its history within the object itself. So it is incredibly significant to railroading history, to the history that we tell here at the Railroad Museum, from taking the commissioners back and forth to inspect the Central Pacific, to the actual event of the meeting of the rails, to being a passenger in passenger service. And then finally, at the end of its life, it was a movie star. So it was in tons of different movies. And then now it's going to live here at the Railroad Museum for 2 years and tell that story. And we should have a digital exhibit up about it in another couple of weeks on our website as well.
Wow, those are some pretty impressive pieces to have on display, and great to be able to have those contributing to the overall story. Will Whitney asks Kim, if you could take one engine from the museum on a joyride, which one would you pick?
I'm thinking about that question in like a couple of different layers. Like, how would I get it out of the museum? Because that's my job, right? In exhibits, my job is to think about how we move stuff around. But if I could just magically grab a locomotive out of the museum and put it on the tracks and then run it, I actually think I would take the CP Huntington out because it's just so small, and I think it would just be so fun to like run it around on a track.
It's fitting that that became the template for this amusement park train used across the country. So maybe sometime you'll get to use the miniature version then, and your full size version can stay inside safe and sound. Part of the collection is equipment, and part of it are these extensive archives. So what are some of the archive collections that you have, and what are their respective points of significance?
Yeah, we have an amazing archives collection. And I think of all of the things we have two things that really stand out to me when I think about um, levels of significance. And one of those is our photographic negatives collection. We have a huge collection of photographic negatives that show everything from, you know, locomotives running down the track to historic events to portraiture, all kinds of things. And the collection is just so rich and deep and full of historical value. I really like the negative collection also because I use a lot of images in exhibits, and I'm able to go into our archives and say, hey, I'm looking for a photo of this. And then our librarians pull stuff out for me, and it's just really exciting. But we also have a full set of payroll records from the building of the Transcontinental Railroad and the Central Pacific that show the contribution of the Chinese railroad workers on the Central Pacific Railroad. Over 90% of the Central Pacific workforce were Chinese labor. And there's very little archival documents written by the Chinese railroad workers themselves for lots of different reasons, but they just didn't last. And these payroll records have the actual names of some of those Chinese laborers, those crew bosses who are coming to collect the payroll. And it has their names written, but also then in Chinese characters as well. And that's just really valuable for our collection because so little archival evidence and documentation exists, that this is something that we can point to and say, look, they were there, they were doing this work, they did contribute, it was valuable contribution. So those records are just incredibly important.
When you look at the entirety of California railroad history, there is just so much to cover. You're talking about the Transcontinental Railroad there, which is obviously monumental, but even things like the rivalry between the Santa Fe and the Southern Pacific, and up to modern day with the proliferation of commuter railroads. What are the key moments and elements that your museum is working to convey?
As I said before, we are railroad people and our lives are made of railroad stories. So our goal is really to bring out the individual stories of people and to share railroad history, and to also talk about the railroad industry, because we are an industrial museum, through the narrative and through storytelling of people. So our primary story within our museum is, of course, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, because the Central Pacific Railroad started building just down the street from us. You know, Sacramento can lay claim to a lot of different major world events, which the gold rush, for example, but also the Transcontinental Railroad. So that is a big part of the storytelling that we do here. And then we also talk a lot about the impact of the Transcontinental Railroad on our economy and the development of our culture, for better or for worse, throughout time, following the completion in May 1869.
You mentioned earlier that when you're thinking about this collection, you are mindful too of your role in displaying it and moving pieces and so forth. Ken Middlebrook says, Kim and I were cohorts in the same museum studies master's program. Ask her about the path to California State Railroad Museum, and also tell her that I owe her a visit and that I will bring s'mores.
Hi, Ken. Yeah, so my personal path, my educational path to get me here, is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. So I started college in graphics design, and fine arts, and then realized that that was more competitive than I wanted to be with my art, because as soon as you create art and it becomes your job, it's not fun anymore. So I got into anthropology and I studied archaeology, and I moved from Sacramento City College to Chico State. And at Chico State, they have a really great program there because they have a holistic program. So each one of the fields of anthropology has a lab and has hands-on things for students to actually do. So when I got there, I was doing archaeology, but then I realized there's this world of museum studies. And so I started working at the Blaine L. Smith Museum of Anthropology, creating exhibits and using my graphics design skills and my art background to actually make exhibits for the museum space, and take my anthropology background and put all of those things together. So I wasn't just creating imagery, I wasn't just creating a story, I was doing 360-degree story development. And that led me to John F. Kennedy University, where I did the museum studies program with Ken. And I did the MA MBA dual degree program. And I worked for a few museums between then and coming here to California State Railroad Museum. I was at the San Francisco Museum and Historical Society for a little while. I did freelance graphics design for small museums. And when we moved back to California, I was looking for work. And I applied here I really applied here just to sort out some audiovisual equipment as a seasonal employee. And Visitor Services pulled my resume off the stack, and I started working with school groups. That was 5 years ago now. And it just took off from there. I started getting into exhibits here, and now I manage exhibits in interpretive programming.
What do you find most fulfilling about the work that you're doing on a personal level?
I'm a serial problem solver. So if I'm solving a problem, I'm the most happy. And exhibits is all about problem solving, from figuring out how you're going to tell your story and build your narrative and put all of these different pieces of historical documentation and historical images together, to the actual design of physical exhibits and then the installation of those things. I find it really satisfying at the end of a project to come out and have this visual representation of a story that tells all of the different facets of a story and complexity, and really talks about people and amplifies the voices of our community that haven't really been heard in this space before, in a really creative way. It's a really great mixture for me of all of my different interests, which is, design and storytelling and community engagement, all wrapped into one.
It's interesting that you use the phrase problem solving. I think that a lot of people would assume that if you have the core content, the core material, whether that be documents or photos or physical items, that just having that on display is sufficient. But you're recognizing that all of these pieces can contribute to a much larger narrative if combined successfully. And especially in this digital age, the amount of tools that are at our disposal to think about both conventional means of just signage and arrangement to how to make the most of technology, computers, websites is really important. Something that I was impressed by from your website was the virtual tour of the Gold Coast rail car, and being able to, from my seat here in Central Virginia, be able to walk through that car and see its history.
Yeah, and that really is based on one of our principles, which is we are a museum without walls. And that is exactly why we created that digital exhibit, along with many of the other digital exhibits that we created during the pandemic. You know, part of that problem solving aspect, though, and we could just put a scroll of documents up on the website, but it's really about the kind of questions that you're asking. And we're asking different questions than they asked when we first opened 41 years ago now, and in the future, they'll ask different questions as well. So our archives are important, but it's also important the kinds of questions that you ask and the kind of stories that those documents tell when you put them all together, So our digital exhibits, especially the one for the Gold Coast, are really valuable not just for our in-gallery visitors who can't actually go inside of the Gold Coast because it's an object, an artifact inside and out. It's the interior of that space is all a historic original interior, and it would compromise the integrity of the object to have people walk through that particular exhibit, because as you walk through the exhibit space, it gets wear and tear. So having that 360-degree experience allows you, whether you're in the museum or 60,000 miles away, to experience what it would be like to actually be inside of that car. And then we also, with the pandemic, have been able to expand our educational programming and our digital exhibits to tell stories that we don't tell or don't have the real estate to tell maybe just yet within the museum. So, physical space is constrained by actual square footage, where the digital space allows you to tell a full and complete story. There's still some space restrictions, but with a more robust, in a more robust way. So there is having the digital space available has been really useful for us. And now that QR codes have been around for a long time. And in museums, we've been talking at the professional level about how to employ QR codes for probably 10 years, but they have not been very accessible. So now you can use your camera on your phone, and most people now have smartphones, to capture the QR code and actually go to whatever digital resource is attached to that QR code. Whereas before, they weren't very accessible. They're still not very pretty, but at the very least, they're much more accessible now.
And that accessibility does matter a great deal. Another shout out to the elements of having a good physical display. Glenn Holland writes, I'd like to pay a compliment. The display created for CP Governor Stanford is a textbook example of how museum locomotives should be displayed, showing an attractive vignette of what the engine would have been like during service years. It is my favorite inside display locomotive for that reason. Excellent job with that.
I'll say thank you on behalf of my predecessors. The Governor Stanford is one of the original locomotives to come into the museum. And that's its original placement in the space. And I agree. I think that, I inherited a lot of exhibit from my predecessors. And I think one of the things I have always really loved about coming to this place, when I was young, that is nostalgic for me, is the sets that we have here. I mean, the Sierra scene is just, you walk into this space and it's granite walls, floor to ceiling, and the Governor Stanford is there in the front. And then on the right-hand side is the snow shed and a great mural of Donner Lake, and it looks out into the distance. And then you have the Chinese railroad workers working right there on the wall. And so it's really impressive the way that they set up this space originally. Yeah, so I will thank you on behalf of my predecessors.
One of the exhibits I'm interested in learning more about is the magic of scale model railroading. Now, that's a partnership with the National Model Railroad Association, correct?
Yeah, so NMRA has been in conversation with, various administrations at the Railroad Museum for the last, I think, like maybe 13 years before I started. And we've just finally been able to kick that over the goal line in the last 3 years, which has been really great. It's a pretty neat exhibit.
And so it's something that brings attention to the hobby elements of railroading. I think a lot of times people put out a display layout and assume people are going to understand that people are devoted to just the scale model element. And so the fact that together you're able to call attention to there is a hobby that is so serious, there is a national organization that sets standards for that hobby, is a good collaboration.
Yeah, I think it's great. And I think it is a great addition to our space. So it's up on the 3rd floor. And when you come off the elevator, the first thing you see is the Sefton toy train collection. Don't get those two confused. And then you come down and you get to see the magic of model railroading down at the other end. And the designers for that exhibit did a great job of showing you the completed work and then showing you the craft that it takes to get to that completed work, which is the part that I really vibe with. Not as much the running of the model railroad, but the actual fabrication of it is really fascinating to me. And the craft of that is really interesting.
Through your podcast, the Roundhouse Crosstalk podcast, what are some of the stories that have really struck a chord for you and conversations that you've had that have proved particularly meaningful?
Yeah, Jake Jennerjohn, Amanda DeFazio, and Jason Rankins do a great job with our podcast. That's my operations team who does all the interviews and runs the podcast. I think one of the most interesting episodes for me is actually one of our really early episodes when we started transitioning our content from, in-house interviews to external content. And that was the Pullman Porter's archival audio collection from Portland. And it was just so interesting to hear the story about who these individual people were and then hear them speak in their own voice and tell us about what their lives were like and what about their job on the railroad and what that was like. I just think that archival content is really interesting and really impactful. But I also really love that we explore railroad music, because what a better topic to explore in a podcast than talk about music, and railroad music is just everywhere.
And so many different genres. People think of your typical bluegrass, banjo, twangly type of folk music, which is certainly there, but also we recently featured a new age artist who recorded an album on an Amtrak trip. So I think the storytelling potential that music offers is something not simply relegated to the past as we might assume, and is yet another way of being able to meet people where they are at in their knowledge and understanding of railroads and their significance. Something else I'm curious about You mentioned earlier that you are involved with community outreach. What are some of the forms in which that takes shape at the California State Railroad Museum?
So, like being a museum without walls, we are also a museum as community and a laboratory of learning. And these principles really help us engage with our community. So that looks like a bunch of different things. Um, a museum without walls, not only digital programming, but also we have an excursion train line where people can go and ride history on the old Walnut Grove branch line. And then we partner with other organizations. We're working with Square Root Academy to help design a STEAM exhibit for our second floor. But then we also partner with cultural community organizations as well, like the US China Railroad Friendship Association, who helped us convene a cultural advisory committee for the redesign of the Chinese railroad workers exhibit. So in 2019, for the anniversary of the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad, we knew that we wanted to do a couple of new, refresh a couple of exhibits, permanent exhibits within the museum, the Gold Spike exhibit and the Chinese Railroad Workers exhibit. Because again, 90% of that workforce were Chinese railroad workers. And the story that we were telling in that space just wasn't complete enough. It didn't really talk about individual people, and it was sort of a few generations of additive things to that space. So we convened a community advisory council made up of a bunch of different organizations that had representation on the council. And we provided them a platform to share their story and to tell us what story they wanted to tell about their ancestors in the space. So we got together over a series of a few months, about 9 months, and worked with them to do storytelling and to talk about what they liked that was in the space already and what they wanted to change. And we worked together to create the content and to create the visual media and everything for that exhibit space. And that was a huge community partnership. And now we're just see the benefits of that relationship over the last 4 years just blossom and grow. They do different Chinese community organizations do different events and things within the museum all the time. It's great.
And Kim, how do these partnerships strengthen the educational potential, not just of your organization, but of these partner organizations?
Anytime you reach out into your community, you're strengthening your community, whether that's through providing programming or working with partners to help them provide programming or build programs together. Because the more people you have working together, the more positive, powerful change you get at the end. And that just exponentially not only makes the programming that we do, educational programming that we do better, and the exhibits that we create better and more representative of our community and more relevant to our community, but the stronger our community becomes as a whole.
Looking towards the future, what are some of the short-term and long-term goals for CSRM?
Yeah, so in the short term, our goals are to bring our educational programming back from all digital education to hands-on and in-person educational programming where students actually come to the museum. But we're also experimenting with hybrid programming where they do a digital education program and then they actually come here to visit and see some of those things work in the world. On the exhibit side of things, we are working with community partners to develop a STEAM exhibit for our second floor that we are very excited about. We only just started that process. So we'll be doing a lot more hands-on throughout the museum, bringing activities, hands-on activities to stations throughout, but then also developing our second floor and making a really great space for both us to work in and our partners as well.
Very exciting. My last question for you today, Kim, is at the end of the day, what makes you the happiest with the work that you're doing at the California State Railroad Museum?
I think the people I work with and my team are the best. I really do think they're fabulous, and I love a day. I always go home feeling fulfilled when we've had great meetings and just really collaborative teamwork, and the progress on projects is moving forward and everybody is excited about the work that we're doing. Because everyone I work with is incredibly passionate and incredibly talented. And it's really gratifying and really fun to see people um, just grow and love the work that they're doing and get really into it and really excited. And so when I go home at night, that is the thing that makes me the happiest, I think.
There's a lot to make one happy. Certainly as a visitor, I have not yet traveled to be able to see your museum, but I certainly hope to someday because everything I've heard, everything that I've seen, both digitally, online from what you have exhibited, as well as just what I've heard in the general community, has been nothing short of praise. Kim, thank you so much for joining us here on the Roundhouse and talking about the work that you and your team are involved with and showcasing this really impressive history and collection.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And now, the question of the day.
We've got a few questions of the day to catch up on. First, we're going to go all the way back to the question of the day from August, which was, as part of our crossover with the California State Railroad Museum and talking about the authors Beebe and Clegg, who is your favorite railroad author? First, Bruce Hucknagel writes, The Wreck of the Penn Central Book by Peter Binzen. I've heard this book come up on a lot of circles. I really feel like I need to get myself a copy. From Blazer Shark on Twitter, Richard E. Prince. He has provided me information on steam locomotives of the South better than anything. It's a shame his books are out of print. If you can get one at a decent price, do it. That's true. Unfortunately, a lot of good railroad histories come into print and go out of print almost just as quickly. So if you see a book that interests you, definitely worth grabbing it while it is still available. Bruce Hain writes, Lucius Beebe, hands down. I got connected with a copy of High Iron early in life. I used to be able to recite some of the beginning of it. Impressive skill, and yes, definitely Lucius Beebe, if you've read any of his books like High Iron or Mixed Train Daily, he has a very unique prose. A very unique prose indeed. And then last month we were talking about the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad, which led to a couple more questions. First being, if you've been to the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad, what was your experience like? From YouTube, David Burrows writes, I took my first ever cab ride at Mount Rainier on Polson Logging 70 in the summer of 2011. At that time, trains didn't run to the shop complex at Mineral, but ran around a balloon loop at Mineral Lake and returned to Elby. After my ride, I drove to the shops at Mineral to get a look at the geared locomotives, and I was given a quick tour by Stothy Pappas. Looking forward to going back someday soon to check out the museum at Mineral. Bill Didden writes, I rode the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad back in the summer of 2015. My dad, granddad, sister, and I rode behind Tank Engine 17. After riding the excursion train, I was amazed with their historic railroad collection, especially their logging geared locomotives. It even felt like I was back at Cass, West Virginia, but in a different region. The railroad also gave me a greater understanding of how the logging industry played out in the role of developing the Pacific Northwest region. This is a historic logging treasure that should be preserved for future generations. Unfortunately, Bill, it is. I'm really excited to see what comes out of LB in the coming years. And for those of you who had not traveled to Mount Rainier, I asked, what is your favorite type of logging locomotive? Peter Rosenquist writes, I haven't been to the railroad, so I would say that Minaret number 17, as it was from the various train videos I watched that showed the Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad. Glad it's coming back. From the RoundhousePodcast.com, Mike Trutman writes, I've not been to Mount Rainier, but my favorite steam locomotive there has to be the Hillcrest Logging 3 Truck Climax number 10. For years, it operated over on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, where I'm from. It spent years hauling logs around... Ooh, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation. Sorry, folks that are from Vancouver Island. Missachi Lake, bringing cars to and from the Esquimalt and Nanaimo Railway, and then had a short career on the ill-fated Victoria Central. I believe it was the very first engine to go to the Mount Rainier Scenic and get their operations going. That sounds right to me, Mike. And from one Climax fan to another, good choice. Your question of the day for this episode is, what is your favorite piece of California railroad history? Past or present, would love to know what you love about railroading in the state of California. Let me know on the roundhousepodcast.com, where we have links to social media. And as always, I want to thank you for listening to this episode and encourage you to check out more of our episodes on the roundhousepodcast.com, wherever you download your podcasts, including Spotify, which is something that we added within the past year. I encourage you to check out our archives because we have had a lot of great conversations and there's only more to come. Thanks, and remember that the Roundhouse is our house.